You're tuned to KSQD Santa Cruz, and this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and along with my guests, we're going to be talking about women's self-defense and how it relates to mental health and wellness. During and following the Supreme Court congressional confirmation hearings for Judge Kavanaugh and the sexual assault testimony of Dr. Ford, our country erupted in conversation, bringing sexual assault to the forefront. We heard lots of stories about being assaulted, but far fewer about those who averted assault and how they did it. So with me today to talk about this are former self-defense instructors Tony Crossan and Denise Lido. Let me tell you a little bit about my guests. Tony Crossan is now a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Santa Cruz, specializing in working with couples. But back in the 1980s, Tony trained with an organization called the Women's Self-Defense Council and taught women's self-defense for 20 years at UCSC, for the City of Santa Cruz's Commission for the Prevention of Violence Against Women, and at various locations throughout California and the U.S. Denise Lido is a social justice activist, poet, writer, and editor. She became involved in the women's movement as a high school student in the late 1970s. She was trained as an instructor in the physical and psychological prevention of rape and domestic violence with the Women's Self-Defense Council, one of the first feminist organizations dedicated to women's safety in the U.S. She taught women's self-defense for over 20 years. She and Tony taught classes together and created a training program for instructors. Denise has a neurological condition called laryngeal dystonia. Sometimes her voice will break or tremor, and she may have a difficult time speaking. If this happens, Tony or I will participate as voicing collaborators to help her fill in the gaps in her speech. She likes to disclose this information so that the listener can understand her better. All right, so welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. To get started, Tony, you contacted me about doing the show, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about why you think it's important to be having this conversation now.
Well, when I contacted you, it was maybe a week after Dr. Ford had testified, and in that whole process between Ford and Kavanaugh and the hearing, it really got me right back into thinking about self-defense and all the years that I taught. And I was so impressed by Dr. Ford's testimony that it just really churned it up. And Denise and I went for a hike, and we started talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And because both of us have such a history with women's self-defense, we started thinking, like, what could we do now? What could we possibly do now? We don't have any answers to that yet. But having this interview was just something that we could do, and that's why I approached you, was just to start the conversation up.
Why do you think this topic is particularly important for women today?
Well, the first thing is that the reason it's important is because it's always been important, because violence against women is prevalent. The other reason is because learning self-defense and practicing self-defense, it really can help women heal from what's happened to them. It really can add to their sense of confidence. It can make them feel better about themselves in the world. And it's one of the things we used to say all the time when we taught self-defense was that in order to feel really confident that you can take care of yourself, you need to know way more than you'll probably ever need to use. And that having that level of confidence and that kind of skill at your fingertips just would help people feel better in the world. So I think it's a mental health issue. And the other thing is that when people came to classes, they oftentimes had violence in their history, and that learning the techniques and learning that they could take care of themselves was really added to their mental health.
Can you describe what is a self-defense class?
Well, for us, I think self-defense classes are really different depending on who teaches them. But for us, it was a movement. It was part of the feminist movement. And and Denise, jump in if you want to add anything to this. Okay. That it was teaching women, number one, that they're important, that they're worth defending, to teach them that it's time to maybe overcome their societal conditioning, that they're just meant to be the helpers and the always be nice, and that we taught verbal self-defense, psychological self-defense, physical self-defense. So it was really about taking the students and helping them have a whole different attitude toward themselves as women and their worth.
You know, when I hear you mention those different types of self-defense, I really want to come back to that later.
Okay.
But right at this point, I was really interested in what brought you personally into the work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's such a big question, because I think, as a lot of women do, and this is something that really happened for me when Dr. Ford was testifying, that if I think back over my history, you know, there's a lot of things that happened to me when I was a kid, or when I was growing up, or when I was in high school, that I would say, you know, fell into the category of abuse and or violence. And so because of that kind of history, that when I first was introduced to women's self-defense, it just like hit me like a ton of bricks, like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. Because it was about being empowered. It was about there's another way. It was about addressing abuse and violence and looking at it, instead of just assuming that it's a natural part of life and it's normal. That it was actually saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't so normal. This isn't so everyday. You know, it is okay to look at it. It is okay to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to put up with this anymore. Mm-hmm. And so that's what drew me to it. And I could tell you a specific story if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be
well, one of the things, I mean, I could tell you probably 20, 30 stories, but the one that really comes into my head and really came into my head when Dr. Ford was testifying was that when I was maybe 17 years old, I met this young man at a party, and I really, really liked him, and then he called me up and asked me on a date, and I said yes, and I was really excited because I thought he was a great guy. He was at a different school than me, and so he picked me up. We went out to this party, and we were at the party, and at some point he, like, I can't remember exactly how he did it, but at some point he got me into one of the bedrooms, and he shut the door, and after we were in there just for maybe 30 seconds, like 3 other guys came in, and they started pushing on me. They started to try to get my clothes off. They started to do all this stuff, and I was saying, no, I don't want to do this. Whatever this is you have in mind, I don't want to do it. But they were very forceful, and one of them pushed me down on the bed, and at some point, the guy that I was on the so-called date with, he kind of crawled on the bed with me and was feeling underneath my shirt, and I punched him in the stomach, and I got up off the bed, and the other guy started laughing and said, let her go. And so then I left, and I went and called my mother, and she came and picked me up from the party. And so those kind of situations, they stay with you, as Dr. Ford was very clear about. And I really think that if I wouldn't have punched him in the stomach, I might have been gang raped.
Wow.
It could have very easily have happened.
Yeah, and that was before you even had the self-defense class?
Right, and you know, and one of the things I know now after teaching for so long is that punching someone in the stomach is about the worst place you could punch them, because there's all these muscles and everything there. You know, we taught how to address blows against the vital areas of the body. We called them vulnerable areas. And I could go into that if you want at some point. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it worked is what's important.
Yeah, and that you successfully protected yourself.
Yeah. And I got out of there, but, you know, I was shaken. And I didn't tell my mother. My mother came and picked me up, and she's like, why are you calling me? You were on a date. And I'm like, I just need to go home. And I didn't tell her what happened because I was so filled with shame.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you want to say, what do you think? Because that was what came up in the hearings, too, was why didn't she talk about this before? And now you're saying you had an opportunity to tell someone right there, immediately after, and you didn't. So do you want to just explain what do you think was going on for you that would keep you from saying something at that time?
Well, I really think I thought I was going to get in trouble. That I thought my mother would say, why did you go in the bedroom? You know, why didn't you, like, scream? Why didn't you this? Why didn't you that? I really thought I was going to get in trouble. And so that's why I kept it a secret. And I was so filled with shame that it even happened, that these guys were groping me under my clothes when I was terrified.
Right, so there's embarrassment about that, too.
Shame.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fear of not being believed. Mm-hmm.
So from your work with lots of women, did you hear other stories similar to your own?
Oh, millions. I'm not exaggerating. No.
Yeah, over 20 years, there would be a lot. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
So Denise, you worked with Tony, and what brought you into this kind of work? And
Well, you mentioned that I got involved in high school, so I came out as a lesbian in high school. I became involved in the women's movement. It was a very radical time, civil rights, gay and lesbian rights, and so on. And I was studying Aikido, and one of the original instructors of the Women's Self-Defense Council was in that class, and she gave me a flyer. And I thought, oh my God, the best of both worlds. Like this feminist activity class that I could do that was connected with everything else. So very soon after I took my first class, fell in love, and became an instructor. And that was for 20 years.
yeah, and if I understand, you were an instructor very young. How old were you?
Yeah, I trained, my first class was 17. I was an instructor late 17, 18. Yeah, and for 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, a big part of your life.
Yes.
And as you were working with the women, what were you learning about as women started to defend themselves? Did it become even more important to you to the work? And if so, why? What were you seeing?
Yes, I mean, it intersected with being young, but it also intersected with what I was learning at the time. So, ditto for everything Tony said. But also, I was learning that empowerment came neck to neck with working with fear. So I learned that vulnerability of walking down the street, of being at home, of domestic violence, of familial sexual assault, all of the ways that violence against women manifested in the world, it taught me that we were whole, that we were true women, that we had choices, that this was a cutting edge, powerful moment in the movement that carried. I mean, at the time, we had very few resources. It was extraordinary to think about it now, and the dearth of resources. But Tony and I were talking, and it's what's different today is the resources, the amount of resources, but the violence hasn't changed. So to circle back to the actual question, that's what I learned. It was kind of global and very specific.
When you were teaching the classes, Tony, what did you see women taking away from it?
Gosh, that's such a big question. Because, I mean, I guess what I feel like I want to do right now is just describe it a little bit.
That would be good.
You know, and I kind of want to start it. I want to start with the when Denise was talking, it made me think of this, how huge the movement was at that time. You know, we're talking about the early 80s. And when Denise and I came to Santa Cruz and we were going to teach our first class at Loudon Nelson Center, and we walked into the front door, and all the hallways of Loudon Nelson Center were packed with women. And I said to the woman at the front desk, I said, "What are all these people doing here?" I thought maybe it was a concert or something. And the woman said, "They're here for your class." And we were just completely blown away. And it was incredible. And for 20 years, pretty much, all of my classes were like that. I had to draw names out of a paper bag to let 30 people into each class out of the 75 or 100 that would show up that day. I mean, and when you think about that now, that many people were like rallying to learn how to take care of themselves. I mean, I dream of that we would see another movement like that where Loudon Nelson would be packed with women wanting to do this class. And so I just wanted to throw that in because it was just such a remarkable time.
What do you think made that happen for women at that time? Was it that there was a dearth of other, like this was so new, this possibility for women?
Yeah, it was a grassroots movement. It was part of the feminist movement. It was an uprising. It was new. It was powerful. People were hearing about it. It spread like crazy. You know, I'd get calls from people in other states wanting me to go there to teach them and their friends because they heard about it from their cousin that lived in Santa Cruz. I mean, it was just this huge thing. Do you want to add anything to that, Denise?
Yeah, I was thinking that it was commensurate with what was actually happening, the violence that was taking place. So if 1 in 4 women are being sexually assaulted...
And that number has not changed from what I understand.
That's right. The part about the violence hasn't changed. And, you know, a woman every 2 minutes, right? So to me, the women coming to the class was commensurate to what was happening in the world.
Yeah.
So many women were being assaulted in the home by acquaintances, by strangers, everywhere and anywhere.
In college, as we've heard so much about recently.
In college.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that's,
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to add to what you just said is that, you know, that was a myth that we had to address in our classes, that most women came into self-defense classes thinking that majority of rapes or attacks happen by strangers, when in fact the truth is most attacks happen by people you already know.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of want to go back to your question, Deborah, which was, what did we notice in the classroom?
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know...
you were going to describe the class, actually.
Yeah.
And I think that would be good. Like, what are the components of self-defense class?
Yeah.
What make it up?
Well, what differentiates what we did in terms of women's self-defense, what differentiates it from like a martial art class, is that our techniques were street techniques. They were easy to learn, easy to master, so that people had tools. Our classes were 8 weeks, 30 hours, and I think that length of time is really important. And
why do you think that length of time is important? What happened? What did you see happening when you spent that amount of time?
Yeah, that the techniques were easy to learn, like I was saying, and then the big part of the class was psychological and verbal self-defense. I mean, we pretty much taught people that self-defense is whatever works, whatever you can come up with. You know, and I have a little story I want to tell, is that one time a high school friend and I, we were out messing around and we met these 2 guys somewhere and ended up at one of their apartments, and we were sitting there just having, you know, just hanging out with these 2 guys, and one of them walked over and started to lock the door, and my intuition really went off, and my friend Shelley, her intuition really went off too, and we were really tuned in that way, and that is just, we would teach that in our classes. Follow your intuition, follow your impulses. People almost always say that they knew something was coming before it happened, so that is huge, to believe in yourself that much. And so we did at that time, and we were only like 17. And Shelley said, "Oh, I have to go to the bathroom, and I never go to the bathroom without Tony." And so the 2 of us went in the bathroom, and we snuck out the bathroom window, and we got away. And so we would teach people in our classes that, yes, that's self-defense too. It isn't just smashing someone in the nose or in the groin. It's using your wits about you, using your smarts, following that intuition, getting yourself out of dangerous situations. That's the most powerful form of self-defense there is.
You know, I actually took one of those classes back in the 1980s, and I remember one of the biggest things for me was lie, that you can lie.
Yeah.
And that can be very useful, and out of everything that I learned there, that was the one thing that I have in fact used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can lie, you can I mean, there's so many different things. And verbal self-defense is huge. It was a huge part of our classes. People using their voice, using the word no as a complete sentence, teaching women how to yell rather than scream. Yelling is more powerful and more gets your chi energy going. And
can you say what that is? People might not, our listeners might not know
it's
what
kind
chi.
of your core energy, chi, or what else is it called? In Hawaiian is called prana, but it's just that energy that you have. But when you hear stories of people picking up a car because their baby's underneath it, that would be them engaging their chi energy.
Their power.
Yeah, their power. Yeah. And verbal self-defense can be in the form of demands, not, like being really broken record technique is something we taught, where you say the same thing over again. Somebody's on your front porch, you want them to get away. You would say over and over again, get away, get off my porch, no matter what they say. Can I use your bathroom? You don't let them
Why do you keep saying the same thing? How does that work?
Because if an attacker is trying to get inside you, they're going to be using all kinds of things to do that.
To engage you in some way.
You say, get off my porch. Oh, but I really need to use your phone. Or, can't you just come out here for a minute and talk to me? If you start following what that person is saying, you become more vulnerable to them. But if you just say the same thing over and over and over, they eventually, hopefully, will give up. And verbal self-defense is another example is this woman that was in one of my classes. She was being attacked by a man with a knife, and he was laying on top of her. He had the knife at her throat. He told her he was going to kill her, and she said to him, "I'm really sorry for whatever it was that happened to you that made you want to kill me." And he rolled off her and started crying, and she called the police. I mean, that's a real story.
Wow.
So that I think is verbal, psychological, all wrapped up in one. How did she know how to do that? That was following her instincts about what to do to save herself. I mean, most attackers say that when women scream or beg for mercy or whatever, it actually makes them want to attack them more. And I'm not saying that if people who do that, it's their fault if they get attacked. I'm just saying we're looking at what works.
Yeah.
And that screaming and begging for mercy doesn't work.
Yeah.
But saying something like what this woman said worked. At least it worked for her.
So over the course of the class, I would imagine people have to really practice that.
Practice all of it.
Yeah, and take time, because it would be hard to even figure out how to access that.
Yeah, I mean, the classes were pretty much a support group in some regards. There were women from all walks of life, all different kinds of histories, some with violent histories, some with not. And they supported each other. We had times where we just talked, and then we taught all these different techniques. We practiced a lot. People had amazing things happen in terms of healing.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM, KSQD, K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. In case you're just joining us, we're talking about women's self-defense. On average, nearly 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States. With me to discuss this topic are self-defense instructors Toni Crossan and Denise Lito, and we're exploring the ways women can and do successfully defend themselves from attacks. Denise has a neurological condition called laryngeal dystonia. Sometimes her voice will break or tremor, and she may have a difficult time speaking. If this happens, Toni or I will articulate a word or phrase for her in order to fill in the gaps in her speech so that she is understood. Back to our interview. Denise, as you hear Toni talking about that content in the class, is there anything that you want to add in terms of what the importance of how you ran that, it being the length of time that it was, and what women were learning?
Sure. One of the things that stood out for me in the class, and we were talking about this, is the way in which Toni and I weren't afraid to touch the true reality of an attack. So when we role played. We used language that a perpetrator would use. We affected attitudes that a perpetrator would have. We enacted actual physical attacks. And that was cutting edge at the time. And we went there so that women could, it wasn't sugar-coated. It was like, oh, here's a couple techniques, go out in the world. It was like, this is the way it is. You're scared. These are some tools to help you work through it, to help you stay present in the moment. Because if you're being threatened with violence, then you want to flee, you freeze, and all of that. And so we were to keep women present in the moment all this terrible thing was unfolding. So I would add to what Tony was saying, this notion of staying your body, owning your body, owning what was happening, and learning techniques of assertiveness.
How to stay powerful, even in those situations.
Yeah.
So you people almost had to run through it again to get that opportunity to find their power in that actual situation, it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, we pushed them into the fear so that they could find they could claim what we were teaching them.
Yeah.
And that would start a healing. And that would lead to techniques that overlaid into other aspects of life. So if they're learning assertive techniques, that could go to work, that could go into the family. So that was really powerful.
Wow. It made me wonder, what did you see as people did that? What did you see happening for them? For instance, they went into the fear. That sounds like it could be scary, but what did you actually see happening for people when they went through that and, practiced it and found their power in that situation that had been so terrifying for them?
Do you want to get that, Denise?
Sure. We didn't just sort of usher them into places of excruciating reality. We tempered it. We always held it. We wanted to tell a true story, but we wanted the women to leave holding the truth of that story with a powerful embrace. So rather than sort of explode their world and explode notions of safety, we were trying to gift how to be safe, how to work with the fear, not to be attached to conditioning, like being polite, just doing what you needed to do, no matter what. And so that was a way that's why the class was so complex. And it's extraordinary for me to look back at the 80s. How did we know to do that?
Yeah.
We were doing stuff and creating stuff with other women. That was new. It was
totally new.
It was totally new.
It was.
We were inventing it as we went along.
And now it's, Tony, you know a lot about trauma, don't you? What would you say, what did you stumble on about the healing of trauma when you were doing that is sort of known now?
Well, I think that when we would push them to that fear point, that they have felt that fear before, right? Especially people who had been attacked or victimized in some way. They had felt that fear before, but this time they knew something to do with it. They knew, and so I would say that probably new neurotransmitters were created in people's brains when all of a sudden they're in that fear and they go, oh, that's right. Now I know how to kick. Now I know how to hit. Now I know how to yell. Now I know how to say, get away from me. Now I know I have all these tools that I didn't have before. So then as people were pushed to that fear point in class and they successfully got away from their attacker, then they were exhilarated. They were absolutely exhilarated. It was so healing. It was like a whole new lease on life.
Yeah, they got to script a new ending to that whole...
Right. You know, and there was one woman in one of my classes who had this frozen neck. She had a very traumatic history, and she'd been to therapy. She'd been to every chiropractor, every body worker she could find, and her neck was just completely frozen. She couldn't move it at all, side to side. And after she was yelling, and I was holding up a mat, and I told her to visualize her attacker on the mat, and she started hitting against the mat and yelling, and her neck released, and she stayed in touch with me for years and told me it never froze up again. I mean, that's just a direct healing right in that, because she was using new things, new skills to deal with that situation.
Mm-hmm. Did you see a lot of that connection between the body and people's sort of psychology and trauma, and did that come up in your classes?
Oh yeah, all the time. That was always present. It was always there, because there were so many people that had been attacked in classes. And so there was always that element of what could I have done? What can I do? Yeah.
All right. So, I'm just so interested, as, you know, both of you were really stimulated to like start having this conversation right now. And I wondered if there's anything you want to say, like as you're talking about it, what are you thinking about why we should be here talking about it today?
We're in a moment in time that is unprecedented. So we have the Me Too movement, we have Time's Up. I mean, there's no time to list all of the resources. When Tony and I were going to do this show with Deborah, I thought, what's out there? I want to see what the resources are. Because in the 80s, we had maybe a page, you know, and I'm up to 30 pages. And they're resources that address people with disabilities, intersectional and inclusive classes, dealing with race, the military, sexual harassment. You know, it's crossing borders, really, that we didn't have access to then. And so when the Kavanaugh hearings occurred.
The Kavanaugh hearings.
And Dr. Ford was testifying. It was so moving and so activating for so many of us. So it brought up for me past personal trauma, and it brought up for me how I learned, you know, healing skills over the years. And so Tony and I were talking about it, and just, is there something we want to do now? Is there something we want to resurrect from our past? Is there a historical story? Because sometimes that history gets lost.
That history gets lost, yeah. So are these classes going on now that you've been describing from what you are aware of? Here in Santa Cruz?
I actually don't know. There's a lot of classes, I think, that are taught by martial artists, and, you know, and I didn't have time to look into that before this.
Yeah, so I took a look, and I actually, I mean, I sort of know that I didn't see that there was a lot, not like what you described was going on at that time.
Yeah, and I would think that, you know, one thing that we could talk about, like right now or at some point before we end today, would be if people are interested in self-defense classes that are similar to what Denise and I are describing, we could tell people what to look for.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. What should they be looking for in a self-defense class?
Well, I think they should look for something that's more than like a 4-hour afternoon class, for number one, that it takes time to get all of this in your body, and so to find a class that has some length to it, and a class where you don't have to be a belt in a martial art to feel like you have ability. That the techniques go toward the vulnerable areas of the body, which are instep, knee, groin, solar plexus, and nose and throat, and eyes. Those are the vulnerable areas of the body. So you'd want a class that teaches women or people how to direct their blows against those areas of the body.
That makes me think of a question, kind of jumping back a little bit,
Okay.
but who was in your classes? Like, were these all strong, able-bodied women, or what did you see among the people who were taking these classes and able to learn effective techniques from it?
It was everybody. It was all ages. We had senior citizens, we had kids, I taught a couple classes to kids, but we didn't go that done into the kid level, but at least teenagers above.
Mm-hmm.
So they were all, and we had all physical abilities. We just worked around things. If somebody was in a wheelchair, we of course adjusted techniques to them. So it was everybody.
So that's a real difference in what you're sort of recommending. It shouldn't have to be a class that only somebody very physically able would be able to take.
Right. Yeah. It has to be a class that's geared toward self-defense, not so much martial arts. Mm-hmm. That's what I think.
And I think that it also is very important to talk about classes that would connect with different communities.
Different communities.
Uh-huh.
So there's a way that violence is universal, but there's a way that it's very specific. Things occur, for example, for Black women that don't occur for white women. Things occur for undocumented workers that don't occur for white women with privilege, and so on. Gender non-binary people.
Gender non-binary people that are often victims.
Exactly. And so I would say look for classes that would speak to you, because otherwise you're walking into a space that isn't as safe. So you're looking for safer spaces. Vet the classes so you can see if the instructor is inclusive and does speak to these different issues. So that I just wanted to add that part.
Yeah. And of course, the class needs to include verbal self-defense, psychological self-defense, classes that to try to overcome what people have been taught, what I was saying earlier about women especially being taught to be nice and to not speak, to not do certain behaviors, that you want a class that's just going to break through everything and just be like, hey, you are a badass and you can defend yourself if you want to.
And classes that are grounded in the 21st century. So classes that address cyber stalking, for example.
Yeah.
Classes that address being, on Facebook and what occurs in social media. Classes that address the gamut of ways in which women in other marginalized communities are harassed, where there's macroaggression and microaggression, so that it isn't just...
Can I say that again? Because I think that's really important.
Please do.
She said, Denise was saying to look at both macroaggression and microaggression, and that both are important. Do you want to say what that is? Some people might not know what you mean by that.
Sure. Over time, as we've learned, as activists have learned more about how to address various political issues, then it's become important to acknowledge the ways in which racism occurs, the ways in which misogyny occurs, transphobia, disability phobia. And so in the language, the way that language has changed over time is trying to capture, implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
And we used to call it just harassment.
Just harassment. Mm-hmm.
And so now we have a way to kind of unpack that and look at what if somebody says something sexist or violating in line at the grocery store. That's an example of a microaggression. What if you're at work, for example, you're an academic, you're sitting around a table discussing, what you're going to teach, and something occurs that's so misogynist your head explodes. That's a microaggression. A macroaggression would be if you leave that room, somebody attacks you, somebody violates, somebody turns to you to be verbally abusive or psychologically abusive.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, community radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. In case you're just joining us, we're talking about women's self-defense. 1 in 5 women have been raped in their lifetime, with impacts such as injury, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, contraction of sexually transmitted diseases, and other mental and physical health issues. With me to discuss this topic are self-defense instructors Tony Crossan and Denise Lido, and we're exploring the ways women can and do successfully defend themselves from attacks. Denise has a neurological condition called laryngeal dystonia. Sometimes her voice will break or tremor, and she may have a difficult time speaking. If that happens, Tony or I might articulate a word or a phrase to help fill in the gaps in her speech. Back to our interview. All right, so we were just talking about all the different ways that that women can feel victimized, women and others can feel victimized, and why, the role of these classes. I was also wondering about if people are thinking about signing up or looking for a class. We've talked about what to look for. What should they personally prepare themselves for? What's important for them to think about as they might get ready for this? Like, for instance, about their own histories or what might get triggered or brought up for them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say that just to be open to learning about themselves, about others, about other people's experiences, about their own experiences, and to be learning what's being offered. That's the best I can say. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that to somehow have access to what will occur, either do some research, look at what's out there, and then once you do that, there'll be a realization of what awareness you need to have. Oh, I had this in my past. I need to tell the instructor if it's safe. Yeah. I need to do that. Oh, I have a disability. I need to make sure it's a safer space for that. So some level of actual practical preparation, and to understand that it is a radical undertaking, that sexual assault is scary, and to enter into a process and a journey to understand it. It will be a journey, and it will be a beautiful journey.
Yeah, intense but beautiful.
Intense but beautiful.
I think about that because as you're speaking, I'm remembering back to my class that they issued some, preparing people that they might have a hard time coming back to class. And you mentioned, I think sometimes people had a hard time coming back to class. Do you want to say any more about that?
Yeah, sometimes people wouldn't show up the second, third, fourth week, and I would call them. And sometimes it was because they were too scared or they'd gotten triggered in a class. And, and very often I was able to talk to them and support them and help them feel comfortable coming back to the class. But sometimes people didn't. And then maybe 2 years later they showed up. And then they completed the class at that time.
They were ready then.
Yeah.
So people might also want to trust their own readiness and.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would add to that, sometimes women might not have come because of being intimidated by what was unfolding physically, even though they were really simple techniques. There would be, the conditioning would unfold. I don't know if I can do that. What if the perpetrator's 6'5" and, really strong? I don't know if I can do that kick. And so if we would call them and explain that the techniques are adjusted for exactly that. And it's not about proficiency. It's about safety. Sometimes they come back,
right.
and we would just cruise from that point on.
Did you see people who were reticent at one point to finish the class be very pleased that they did?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so grateful. And I run into people all over Santa Cruz who say, didn't I take a class from you 30 years ago? And it was the best thing I ever did for myself. And people really got a lot out of it. Because it was a safe place to really talk about what was going on.
Yeah.
In this misogynist world that we live in.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was life-changing. And I think it was, what's the word? It became a shared experience, so much so that when the co-participant would come back, then there was a collectivity to it. And this way that it may have changed isolating behaviors to, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
In my healing or in my past trauma, or being able to talk about it today. And that was really powerful. And it was powerful for Tony. We have stories, and as Tony was talking about, so we would learn from them.
Yeah, and there's one memory I just had pop up when you were talking, is that we had this really, I can't remember, it doesn't matter what her name was because this was so long ago, but there was a woman who was a really conservative politician in Santa Cruz County at the time, really straight-laced, very conservative. She comes marching into our class. And then there was another woman in our class who was more of a punk, and she had like leather on and chains hanging all over her. And at some point in the class, Denise poked me and said, "Look." And over in the corner, the two of them were sitting nose to nose, having a heart-to-heart talk, and they were holding hands. And we were just like, oh my God, this class just brings people together. It just, it never would have expected the two of them to connect and relate to each other, and they did.
And
that
was
really beautiful.
A great story.
Yeah.
And that was an example of transcending intergenerational demarcations, that we had women of all ages and all ways of being in the world.
Yeah.
And I remember that story.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking part of what was really moving about it was that one of the women was younger and the other one was older.
Yes.
And so the classes really spoke to what can sometimes be a gap in age.
Mm-hmm. But what's universal among us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow, that is a great story. I love that image.
Yeah.
So we have just, a limited amount of time left. So I was thinking it would be really good to maybe talk about if somebody felt stirred by this conversation, and felt like there was something they would want to do, what would you, and this could be for either of you, what would you suggest at this point, or what would you recommend? Where would you say that they start?
Oh, gosh, that's a hard question.
If I can
go ahead.
jump in, is I would suggest starting at, if it's just the nascent moment, if this is a moment when it's the first time you've sort of heard this kind of thing, to go on the internet, boom, do a search, see what fits, see what the ideas are, see what people are talking about, look at the research, fill yourself with the possibilities. And for example, the Me Too movement has a history before now. So it was started in 2006 by Tawana Burke, who wanted to offer something to Black women and girls. And now look what's occurring. I mean, it's this explosion of women telling the truth. Uh-huh. So to enter into that, like, where am I in that? Grab this moment and take it forward. Mm-hmm. Look at, in practical manners, look at classes, vet them, stuff that we've already talked about. If you want to organize and become an activist, explore inclusivity in groups and reach out. Yeah.
Reach out
if you can, in any way you can.
And I have something else to add to that.
Yeah.
And this really came up for me after Dr. Ford testified. And I was thinking about how much women have defended themselves, how much they have used, like my friend and I sneaking out of the bathroom window to avoid whatever those men had in mind, that I think that everyone should, besides just what's happening in the Me Too movement and all the people that came forward after Dr. Ford and said, this happened to me, I also would love for all of us to start telling the stories of when we got away, when we trusted our intuition, when we were able to escape without getting harmed, when, whatever we did, whether we lied, whether we, snuck out windows, whether we avoided getting into a car with somebody that our intuition was saying, don't do it, don't do it. To tell those stories too.
That makes me think that there was a resource that you had brought up. Do you remember what that was? Do you want to share that with our listeners?
Yeah, it was a book that was written probably in the 80s, might have been early 90s. It was called Her Wits About Her.
Can you say that again?
Her Wits About Her. And it was a collection of stories, and it was put together by some women in Santa Cruz, Gail Groves and Denise Cagnon. And I Googled it yesterday, and it's available used all over the internet. And it's a really great book to read, because it's just story after story after story of women using really unusual things to get away from an attacker.
It helped to look at ways to try to be safer. One of the most powerful moments with Dr. Ford's testimony was when she talked about building a second door.
Yes.
In her house.
Yeah.
I mean, I just was so moved by that at the horror and terribleness of why she had to have a second door, and the incredible, awareness and strength of her to say, here is this second door. So to piggyback on what you're saying about what did I do, that's part of it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's going to be on a resource list that we'll have posted along with the podcast on the radio station. So, and on that resource list, there's going to be a number of other resources, Denise, that you spent some time putting together. Do you want to say something about those generally?
Yeah, sure. I've been alluding in the conversation and in some of the questions that Deborah asked about resources. But I'll just say briefly that there are a lot of resources now. At the same time, those resources may not speak to you, they may not fit who you are. So don't give up and keep searching, but there may not be a resource. It's not like we've covered everything. And so there's still gaps in knowledge, gaps in what's out there. There's barriers to access. Do the classes cost money? How much do they cost? Where are they? Do I have transportation to get there? All of these issues can impede access to resources. And so it's our job to figure that out and to change that. So I became kind of obsessed with, I thought I was going to have a page, and it's like 30 pages, as I mentioned, and that's great.
Yeah, we're going to make that available as well, a link to Denise's ongoing and growing resource list to share with our listeners. There's a lot of really great material on there. So thank you so much for doing that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to wrap up now. And before we do, I just thought, sometimes people think of those last things that they'd really want to, leave anyone listening with, those last sort of pearls of wisdom or thoughts that maybe haven't yet gotten expressed. So I wonder if either of you have anything like that you want to say. Any closing comments?
I think I would say that in 2018, we have new ways of addressing these issues. We have new language. We have new direction. We have new substance. And that dovetails with what occurred already. So there's this rich history that sometimes is overlooked, doesn't get talked about. And Tony and I are very committed in certain ways to not have an ahistorical approach. And so I just wanted to say that because if we're speaking across age and across race and across class and disability, that's real. It's occurring. And it's really important. And that's what I wanted to reinforce, although I have already. I'll just say it again.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. All right. Well, gosh, I just want to thank you both so much for coming in and talking about a very important subject for our times.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah.
And thank you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. For more stories and conversations about mental health and wellness here on the Central Coast, join me on the first Sunday of the month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid 90.7 FM. All State of Mind shows seek to educate by featuring personal stories of mental health recovery and wellness and the sharing of resources. So if you have a topic idea or have a story to share, email me at debra.stateofmind@ksqd.org. Special thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music, and to Lauren Fine for her production assistance and expertise. If you like what you're hearing, please help us keep it going and go to the donate button on our website, ksqd.org. You can also find all the podcast episodes of this show there. Just type State of Mind in the station website search bar. This is listener-supported community radio for the Monterey Bay, KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us because coming up next is the Hive Poetry Collective.